Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute. Welcome to today's International Strategic Webcast featuring our president and founder, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. We have some really big news to report to start the program, which comes from Abuja, the capital of Nigeria, where there was a conference that took place that took up as a theme a project that's near and dear to our hearts that Helga's been fighting for many, many years. So Helga, give us this report on what happened in Abuja.
Well, it is really fantastic because, there was this conference in Abuja on the Lake Chad crisis with the participation of the Nigerian government and Niger, and I think some other governments from the region. And they adopted officially the Trans-Aqua project. They came to the conclusion as a resume after the conference that there is no way how to solve the Lake Chad situation except with bringing water from outside, and that this is not an option but a necessity, and that the preferred solution is the Trans-Aqua project. Now, let me quickly explain what this is. This is if it will be realized, it will be the largest infrastructure project, I think, in all of history, because it is the idea which was developed already in the 70s by the Italian engineer firm Bonifica to take some of the water of the abundant water of the tributaries of the Congo, take about 3-4% of this water, which is now going unused into the Atlantic, and redirect it from 500 kilometers height above the sea ground, and bring it through a system of canals into Lake Chad. Now, this works very well because of the gravity difference of these 500 kilometers, so it's a very efficient system. And it would not just refill Lake Chad, which is obviously an absolute urgent necessity because this lake has dried out until it's left only 10% of its original volume. And naturally, the poverty, which has been increased through the lack of water, has given rise to the terrorist Boko Haram. So that's one of the reasons why all the countries participating in this now say it's not an option, it's a necessity, because if you don't realize such a development program, you can as well hand over the whole territory to the Boko Haram. So it would mean to refill Lake Chad, it would mean to have plenty of water for irrigation of the Sahel zone. It would give water to all the 12 participating countries, but not only water, it would build a modern infrastructure in the heart of Africa. It would create an inland waterway for these countries for shipping. And naturally, it would generate a lot of hydropower. So this is really, really fantastic. And, the Schiller Institute has been campaigning for this project as part of our World Land Bridge. And even before, I think we started to make conferences for this, I think already in the beginning of the 90s. And we worked with the engineers of Bonifica. So, it's really our work. There was an article in People's Daily already last year, which said the fact that the Schiller Institute made this connection between Power China, the Chinese engineering firm, and Bonifica, is really thanks to the work of the Schiller Institute. So I'm very happy that this is happening. At the conference, the Italian ambassador to Nigeria proudly announced that the Italian government will take over half of the cost of a feasibility study, which is now going to go into motion. And all the people were completely passionate about this idea. They were happy. They were, really happy. And we had 2 members of the Schiller Institute as participating guests at the conference. And, our Claudio Celani, who's Italian, who did a good work on all of this, and also one of our French members, Sébastien Perromoni. Shelani brought in the question that this is not just infrastructure, and this is not just these two countries working together for the first time, but that this can be a model for the new paradigm cooperation in the context of the new Silk Road. Because you have China, you have an Italian country, a European country, Italy, and the African nations working together on such a very far-reaching project. So I think this is really fantastic, and I'm absolutely convinced this will function, because Bonifica is an extremely efficient company, and Power China is also, they have a great expertise. This was the company which built the Three Gorges Dam, so they have a lot of experience with such large earth moving and similar kinds of technologies. So this is really, really good. I mean, it obviously means that with these kinds of projects, there is a perspective of solving the refugee crisis, because that is exactly what is needed. You have to get the young people involved in building such projects. And as the president of Ghana at a recent trip to Germany said, that in 20 years, Africa will have 2 billion people. Now you need a lot of jobs, you need a lot of education, you need a lot of things. And I think the president of Ghana at an earlier occasion had also said, that he wants these young people to join in building the continent, rather than, running through the Sahara and drowning in the Mediterranean. He wants to have a reversal of that, and therefore he wants investment and not development aid. And this is exactly an example how it can be done. So I think this is really good news for anybody who cares about the human species.
And Helga, you mentioned that this is a realization on a big level of the new paradigm. A couple of weeks ago, there was Africa Day in Berlin, and I was talking with a number of African ambassadors about this. And one of them said, Transaqua, that's big. We need big. We don't need people to tell us to be small anymore. We need big projects, and we need the leapfrog. Now, this is in the context of the overall advance of the new Silk Road dynamic. I know there's been a lot of discussion in China about projects that are underway. And why don't you fill us in on what's going on from China on this?
Well, I think the Silk Road spirit is really catching on. I mean, there was a conference, for example, just now in Dubai, where the Global Business Forum and the president of Panama, in an interview with Xinhua, completely endorsed the Belt and Road Initiative and said that he wants Panama to be a part of it, and that they have now agreed with China to build a fast train road railway system between Panama and Costa Rica as a first step, and that this will connect Central America with Asia in a much more productive way. So almost every day you have a new development, and as a result, various Chinese professors commented on that, saying this is not just for China, but this is uplifting the whole world. This gives a model for the developing countries to improve their industrial chain, and all the neighbors of China will do so. And then another professor who wrote several books on the new Silk Road, Professor Yang Yiwei, he basically said, look, the reason why the West is so full of anxieties about the rise of China is because they lack a complete self-confidence about their own economic model, and that is why they are so, so absolutely hysterical about it. But then you had a very beautiful interview from a person with the name of Su Kan-ki. I'm probably pronouncing all of these names wrong, but he is the chief engineer of the Hong Kong-Macau-Zhuhai bridge, which is now completed, including a very long tunnel. And this shortens the travel time between Hong Kong and Zhuhai from 3 hours to 30 minutes. So he was asked if he was optimistic that China, if China could reach its development goals until 2020, 2035, 2050, and he said that he was absolutely certain that this would happen. And this bridge is really fantastic. I had the absolute fortune to be on that bridge end of November. I was invited to a maritime Silk Road conference in Zhuhai, and part of the program was to travel to this bridge. So I was 15 kilometers close to Hong Kong. And this is fantastic. It's the longest sea bridge on the planet. I think it's altogether something like 55 kilometers long. And to build it required 150 patents, which were all invented by Chinese engineers. And this region, the Hong Kong, Macau, Zhuhai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen region. I mean, this is probably the powerhouse of the world economy by now. It's all modern cities, modern, relatively beautiful architecture. I was really surprised to see that. And it's the powerhouse which attracts young, creative people in the high-tech areas. And, I think this is just an example where, you can see that with modern infrastructure, you can make such developments a magnet, and then, everything flourishes around it. And I just would wish that people in the West, in the United States, you could do exactly the same thing. There was, by the way, an article recently saying, could the United States have 7% growth like China? And then the answer was, yes, they could, if they would go back to the economic policies of Alexander Hamilton, which after all is what China is now doing. I mean, China is basing its own model on Alexander Hamilton and naturally Friedrich List and other such proponents of physical economy. And also the theories of my husband are quite known in China, and I think they're also being studied very intensively. So I think this is all very, very good, and I think there is absolute reason for optimism.
And this brings up the broader Chinese diplomacy. Liu He, I believe is his name, is coming to the United States. He's one of the chief economists. He'll be meeting with people in Washington. What do you expect will come from this trip?
Well, I think it's very interesting because there is clearly an effort between President Xi and President Trump, where the good news is also that Xi will now remain president beyond 2020, which causes a big freak out in some quarters. But I think it's a very good development because the Chinese people appreciate his successes in the anti-corruption fight, and also naturally the new Silk Road Belt and Road Initiative is a huge success. And Trump announced that he will rerun in 2020. And therefore, I think it's very important that the two presidents obviously follow a policy of having direct contact with each other, and that way bypassing some of the neocon outfits and efforts to destabilize the relations. So this Liu He was the main speaker on the Chinese side in Davos at the World Economic Forum. And he is the most important economic advisor of President Xi directly. And this follows only 2 weeks after the State Council, Yang Yiqi, was in the United States meeting with Trump and other officials. So I think the personal relationship between Trump and Xi is definitely functioning. And I think this is a very important counter to a lot of other nonsense and anti-China hysteria, which is being pushed right now.
And on the anti-China hysteria, I think we have to take a look at this new report from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which just came out last week, which essentially says China is preparing possible nuclear cruise missile strikes on Washington, assassinating U.S. leaders, and invading Taiwan. This is escalating even further what we've seen in the last weeks. What's going on with this, Helga?
Well, it is obviously what already General Dempsey, the previous Joint Chief of Staff, had warned about, the Thucydides trap. that the so far dominant power, United States, is confronted with the rise of China, and is indeed, if they would follow such crazy scenarios like that of CSIS, would go into the Thucydides trap. Thucydides was the Greek historian who described how the Peloponnesian War developed out of the rivalry between Athens and Sparta, and how that led. I mean, as we know later, that led to the demise of the of ancient Greece. So, if the United States would follow in this trap, it would be naturally absolutely terrible, because China has offered many times a special relationship among the great powers. It has offered the United States to cooperate in the win-win policy of the New Silk Road. So it is really stupid when CSIS has these absolutely utopian conceptions, like they say that Russia could make a surprise attack in the Baltics. I mean, that has no logic whatsoever, because it is absolutely not in the self-interest of Russia to do that. And anybody who knows the situation can see that very clearly. And so there was a very powerful answer to that, actually, to this study in Global Times. And they say, this is the United States being frightened about its own mirror image. And then they quote this utopian from the Pentagon Net Assessment group, or whatever the name was, who developed all these airstrike policies, Andrew Marshall, who had coined this notion of that countries should not have a mirror image approach to other nations, with other words, projecting what their own strategy is on the other one. Now, they say that's exactly what the United States is doing, because, who is pushing preemptive war? It's the United States, which has that in its doctrine, and not China. And who has been pushing regime change? It's the United States, while the policy of China always has been to respect the sovereignty of the other country. And so they go through another couple of such differences. So I think, this is really bad. And I think, people should really not fall for that, because anybody who studies, or what Marco Rubio is saying, that, the Confucius Institutes would spy on colleges. And I mean, it's all absolute paranoia, because you have one very successful model of uplifting the underdeveloped parts of the world out of poverty. And China is absolutely not trying to impose its own model. And the West could go back to their own successful periods, like the American Revolution, Lincoln, John Quincy Adams, Franklin D. Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy. And if the United States would go back to their own strengths, and the European nations to their best traditions, you would not need to import the Chinese model. You would just, become your true identity again. But since the West is not doing that, naturally some people are indeed worried about China. But it's a completely, the perspective is really absolutely wrong.
And we saw the same thing. You mentioned Marco Rubio at that same hearing. FBI Director Christopher Wray basically said that every Chinese student studying in the United States is a potential spy. So this is something worse than the McCarthy era. Now, going along that same theme, we've seen recently a very difficult, rough patch in U.S.-Russian relations, now with the dangers of an explosion in Syria, blaming Russia for what they say is a possible chemical weapons attack that the Assad regime is planning. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov had some comments on this, calling on the U.S. to back the UN Security Council resolution for humanitarian aid in Syria. What's going on there from what you see, Helga?
Well, after the Russian intervention in September 2015, basically step by step, the Syrian territory was reconquered. And now you have only very few enclaves which are in the possession of, or in the control of, Al-Qaeda related groups. And one of them is the suburb of Damascus, East Ghouta. Now, I use the image just to get people an idea. You know, if you would have, let's say, in Potsdam or in Schwabing, thousands of ISIS fighters, and they would be shelling the inner city of Berlin or Munich, or let's say if the same thing would happen from New Jersey into New York. I mean, what would be the reaction? I mean, the government has the absolute right to try to stop that. And since these terrorists keep the population hostage, like now, due to Putin's intervention, it was possible to have a 5-hour corridor ceasefire per day. But you know, you can really see that these terrorist forces are trying to prevent the population from leaving, because they are the human shield behind which they are hiding. So I think that the accusations of the West, who some of them are still obviously on the policy of regime change. I mean, this was the policy of the European Union, of the German government, of the British government, absolutely. And this is absolutely wrong. I think it will not happen, but these policies just escalate the suffering of the Syrian people. And, you know, I think it will not work, because I think the forces now backing the Assad sovereign government are, you know, they have really proven to be militarily superior. But it's a terrible tragedy, and it should stop immediately.
And speaking of tragedies, we've had a new debate in the United States following the killings that took place at the Parkland High School in Florida. There's a very interesting intervention by the governor of Kentucky, Bevin, who made the comment that what we're looking at is a culture of death. And in this, I think the theme that you've taken up with the Schiller Institute over many years about the necessity to address the cultural degeneration, which is directly related to warfare and so on, is a key point to bring up. So I'd like you to present your thoughts on this, because this is something that is at the heart of a lot of the discussion in the United States, but it's not a local issue. It's part of the overall degeneration of the culture there.
Well, many years ago, I gave a speech about the danger of Pokemon, the danger of certain violence movies, the danger of video games. And, you know, at that point, I looked at it, and it was very clear that some of these videos come directly from the Pentagon strategic studies. They come from training programs, you know, because in the post-war period, people realized that during World War II, only 15% of the soldiers were willing to shoot at the enemy, because there is a natural block in people to shoot on other human beings. So the aim of these video games initially was to increase the killing rate of the army, and that became then the commercial video games. And you know, this has reached a degree of violence for violence sake. And there was this woman who's a member of the VIPs, I think her name is Miss Rowley, who pointed in the context of the Parkland shooting to the fact that the Pentagon and the CIA have in the last years cooperated with Hollywood in 1,800 movies where the hero is some kind of a deranged person, some veteran of foreign wars who had a post-traumatic disorder, running around with killing sprees. And you know that this is actually one of the contributing causes of this present explosion of violence. Now, my husband, Lyndon LaRouche, made extremely important comments when the Columbine shooting occurred, where he pointed to the deep cultural axiomatic danger of the United States as a result of this. So since Columbine, there were 38 school shootings with fatal consequences. After the Parkland shooting, there were 50 alarms in schools per day. Obviously, pupils being concerned about other pupils having weapons or having strange social messages. So I think this is really it reaches a point where, this has to change. And it's very good that President Trump made some extremely important comments on that. He met with some of the pupils from the Parkland School, and he said there is a terrible violence, a lot of it in the internet, which is shaping the minds of the kids and the young people, and that he was considering a rating system for movies which may not have sex and therefore are not rated, but are actually full of killing. Now, I think this is a step in the right direction, but I think it is not enough. I would really go for a much more radical approach in making legislation forbidding any such movies, because they contribute to menticide of the children. Now, people have argued in the past that you can't block the violence in the internet. I think you can, and people criticize China a lot for blocking certain things in the internet. Now, if the Chinese can do that, so could the West, protecting its own youth and children. I think that this is a very important thing because, as I have said many times, the new paradigm is not just about economics. The new Silk Road is not just a question of transport or infrastructure. It is also a question of developing a completely new conception of the human being, and the kind of bestialization, the absolute terrible lack of dignity of the human person, which Governor Bevin from Kentucky pointed to, is really in a complete 100% opposite of what is needed. We need an image of man which is beautiful, which is creative, which is truthful, which is developing all the potentials of each child in the fullest possible way. And naturally, when you have such a culture of absolute degeneracy, I mean, people are also freaking out about that China is having now a system of, giving advantages to people who behave in the interest of the common good, and giving negative points to people who are not doing that. There is a big debate, at least in Europe, about that. People are absolutely upset about it. And we discussed this, and we came to the conclusion such a system exists in the West since a long time. It's just not called that way. But if you have, like in Germany even, which is not the worst place, you have 25% of all the young teenagers who are regarded by industry as absolutely undeployable. So they won't hire them. They don't get an apprenticeship because they're not motivated. They are autistic. They're just not fit. So they have no chance to get a job. Now, this is a selective system as well. So I think people should just not, they should really think, is this Western system that everything is allowed, everything goes? You have not 2 sexes or 3 sexes, or by now you have something like 49 genders. Is it really okay if the drug epidemic, which in the United States has led to a decrease in the living standard? Governor Bevin pointed to the fact that some of these satanic messages are also in the lyrics of the pop music, in the movies, in the video games. Should we allow all of this and have our society completely destroyed? I mean, there is an effect of all of this on the cognitive powers. Now, if we want to have the 4 laws of London and LaRouche as the only solution to prevent a collapse of the system, well, especially the 4th law demands a crash program for fusion power, for international space research and travel. Now, you can't have people who have destroyed minds because they're hooked to these things and have them become a creative, productive labor power. So it's one and the same discussion, which we need. We need a new paradigm, and we have to have an education system which emphasizes the beauty of classical culture, which emphasizes the beauty of the character as a development goal. I mean, this was an idea of Wilhelm von Humboldt, who after all influenced much of the education system in Europe and the United States in the 19th century and lasted even in large parts into the 20th century. And he had the idea that the aim of education must be the beauty of the character. Now, who talks about that these days? You know, I mean, if you go to some of these kids who are hooked to these to these violent video games, or even worse, who are looking in the internet in terrible material, using, including torture and such things, and getting really destroyed. I mean, the minds become absolutely destroyed. So since Governor Bevin asked for a national debate about that, and also President Trump fortunately wants to take on this issue, I think we need such a debate, because in my view, it's an integral part of the United States joining with the new paradigm and the new Silk Road, because we can't have this continue. And the Schiller Institute has for many years proven that with classical music, with classical poetry, with Schiller, with Shakespeare, you can transform people and have an aesthetical education. And that is exactly what is needed right now.
And I think, Helga, coming back to where we started, introducing projects such as the Transaqua project will give millions of young Africans a sense of a future. And I would encourage people to go to the Schiller Institute and get a copy of the special report we have on that, Extending the New Silk Road into West Asia and Africa, which is available. So Helga, with that, I'd like to thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Yes, till next week.